Rebellions are born on secrecy, distrust, and the cold calculus of war and suffering. But given the fact that so much of Star Wars depicts the Rebel Alliance as an idealistic force for good, we're left wondering how such an organization made up of several disparate groups of freedom fighters could have joined forces when so few of them were willing to get their hands dirty. Enter Luthen Rael, the man willing to make the hard choices, to scheme, deceive, and broker alliances between partisan groups at great risk to himself. But who is Luthen? We know precious little about him other than what he reveals through his interactions with others. However, if we pay close attention to his actions, discourse, motivations, and resources, evidence that he is a former Jedi who survived Order 66 becomes more than mere possibility. When we first meet Luthen, we see him entering orbit and landing on Ferrix in a new type of ship we've never seen before. Unlike most ships in the Star Wars universe, this one has an AI co-pilot, which is rather peculiar and lets us know that Luthen isn't just any ordinary fence dealing in stolen trinkets. We also see him using a metallic cane, despite walking without a limp or impeded in any way, meaning he's likely a man of significance and more regal than his worn and unassuming clothing would seem to indicate. The cane itself becomes even more intriguing after his conversation with Bix, as we see that it actually retracts, revealing a lovely wood-adorned handle which is roughly the same dimensions as a lightsaber hilt designed to accommodate two-handed grip, such as for practitioners of lightsaber form 4 like Qui-Gon Jinn or Yoda, or possibly even a dual-bladed lightsaber like those used by Darth Maul or Pon Krell. As we learn later on, Luthen is a well-known dealer of rare antiquities on Coruscant, and in his shop, if we look closely, we can see several relics of Force practitioners, such as Jedi and Sith holocrons in the background of this shot, the mask of a Jedi Temple guard in this shot, and of course the most obvious Force-related Easter egg we can find is Starkiller's armor, which I think has been teased multiple times in canon by now, though Galen Merrick himself is still Legends. Sorry all you Force Unleashed fans. The fact that Luthen is still in possession of several items which are extremely rare and all linked to now defunct orders of Force worshippers, or so everyone thinks, does mean that he probably would not have had much trouble also acquiring a lightsaber as well, so there's no real proof that it's his. However, some of the most compelling evidence that he's not just a simple antiques dealer turned smuggler can be seen when he's preparing to leave Andor on Aldhani. He gives Andor a Kyber crystal for safekeeping. The crystal is quite large for a lightsaber, but not outside the realm of reasonable if it was used to power a longer than average blade or two-bladed saber. It is interesting to think this piece of Kyber could also belong to the same saber that was modified to become Luthen's cane. He goes on to explain that this crystal isn't red, yellow, purple, or green, but is blue, a symbol of defiance against the Rakatan Infinite Empire, and holy Yoda am I thrilled that Tony Gilroy just made the Rakata canon. Knowledge of the Rakata and their control over the entire galaxy, or at least a very large chunk of it, would not be something that one could simply find at their local library. All knowledge of the Rakata had been lost by 4000 BBY when it was rediscovered by the rogue Jedi Revan, who has also been mentioned in canon just in case people get bent out of shape over the whole Legends canon snafu. Any knowledge of the Rakata would likely be recorded in, you guessed it, Jedi or Sith holocrons, which can only be opened by Force users, so the fact that Luthen has this knowledge is quite telling of his past. It's also interesting that the holocrons in Luthen's shop are much larger than those that appear in most other Star Wars media, so these could in fact contain entire libraries worth of information rather than just being single volumes like we tend to find in most other holocrons. Another piece of evidence that Luthen is a Force user can be seen as Luthen pulls one of the greatest power moves in all of Star Wars canon, and yes, I'm including Rey Jedi mind-tricking stormtroopers and Force-pulling lightsabers with zero Jedi training, and absolutely no reason to even think the Force would allow her to do such things. When Luthen is captured by a Cantwell-class arrestor cruiser, a ship that you might be hearing more about in future entries on this channel, he very quickly devises an escape plan. He uses a hidden flechette weapon which uses the cruiser's own tractor beam emitters against them by accelerating the projectiles as they travel to the ship's tractor beam emitter. I would also just like to add that this is a weapon that you would think would be used way more often as a countermeasure to unshielded fighters like TIEs. When the cruiser launches a contingent of TIE fighters and a boarding craft to apprehend the Fondor hauler, Luthen very quickly eliminates the boarding craft and after passing takes out one of the fighters. This is already quite impressive but could be explained away as simply using his AI to operate his ventral cannon, though based on his very deliberate movement and the fact that he's watching his targeting computer as this is happening, it's most probable that Luthen himself is aiming and firing the weapon. After this exchange, he activates a dual energy beam weapon not so dissimilar from lightsabers, and in a single roll destroys 2 different TIE fighters on either side of his ship and at different ranges to boot. The absolute precision, timing, and speed necessary for such a maneuver is far beyond the abilities and reflexes of any human who is not at the very least force sensitive. However, given the flawlessness of the attack suggests not just force sensitivity, but force adeptness as well, able to draw on the same precognition that allows Jedi to deflect blaster bolts with their sabers. Admittedly, beam weapons like this exist outside of lightsabers, such as LAATs, SPHAs, and even Death Stars. However, most of these weapons tend to have composite beams and only fire for a split second. However, due to the relatively long period that these beams are maintained and that they appear to be projected as a single beam without the need of a focusing dish, this weapon is apparently of a completely different design. Observing the uniqueness of the weapon, 2 red beams facing opposite directions and used in a rotating sweeping motion, it almost appears that Luthen's ship is based on the hilt of an Inquisitor's lightsaber. If Luthen was a survivor of Order 66, his new persona as a rare antiques dealer that caters exclusively to Coruscant social elite would not be something that instantly materialized. He would have likely been hunted during the Great Purge, just like many other Jedi. The Imperial Inquisitors would have likely been a constant concern for him, and there is a very real possibility that he could have faced an Inquisitor and survived. We know a lot about the Imperial Inquisitorius, but there's still so much that we don't know. We don't know if the numbers which take the place of their names is a ranking system to denote their power and strength, or simply the order in which they were inducted into the Inquisitorius. We don't know if the Grand Inquisitor is also the first brother, or if there's another Inquisitor with that title. We do know of Inquisitors numbered 2 through 10, though there are 3 others that have been depicted in various media sans official titles. We also don't know if numbers are gender neutral. For instance, we know of a second sister, but we don't know if there's also a second brother also roaming the galaxy somewhere. We also don't know the total number of Inquisitors, or if Inquisitors are ever replaced after death, though we do know that the longer they operated, the more difficult it would be to find a suitable force-sensitive replacement. All of this ambiguity doesn't prove anything, but it would certainly open the possibility that if Luthen was a Jedi who had survived Order 66, that he could have defeated an as of yet unknown Inquisitor, taken their lightsaber, and later designed this ship-to-ship weapon based on the Inquisitor hilt design, repurposing the Inquisitor's red Kyber crystals as the power source. Taking a quick break, if you're enjoying the video so far, it would mean a lot to me if you would just take 2 seconds to like the video. It really helps out the channel and is a whole lot easier than hurting nerves. Now back to this stuff you actually came here to see. All of this paints a more and more convincing picture that Luthen was once a Jedi, but one thing that we do know now is that he does not appear to use the Force in any overt manner, such as using the Force to buy Andor time to grab the Imperial Starpath unit, or using Jedi mind trick on people he wants to leave him alone. It could be argued that he has cut himself off from the Force as many other former Jedi had. However, there could be a darker reason as to why he doesn't reveal his abilities. What if Luthen has actually turned to the dark side? We truly have no idea what motivates his actions. He is a master manipulator, seemingly able to turn any conversation to suit his desires and machinations. Though it's only for an instant, we can see his possible dark side leanings in his first meeting with Saw Gerrera.
We need the Empire to help. We need them angry. We need them coming down hard. Oppression breeds rebellion. Krieger needs their support.
I'm not for hire.
Think of it. Think of Spellhouse in flames. Neither of you could do it on your own, but together...
Krieger's a separatist. My pay's a neo-Republican. The Gorman Front. The Partisan Alliance. Sectorist. Human cultist. Galaxy partitionist. They're lost. All of them lost. Lost. What are you, Luthen? I've never really known. What are you?
I'm a coward. I'm a man who's terrified the Empire's power will grow beyond the point where we can do anything to stop it. I'm the one who says we'll die with nothing if we don't put aside our petty differences.
Petty? I am the only one with clarity of purpose.
Well, anarchy is a seductive concept. A bit of a luxury, I'd argue, to a man who's hiding in cold caves and begging for spare parts.
Now this is absolutely harsh, but to a man hoping to appeal to an extremist like Saw, this is a completely reasonable statement to make. However, we have no idea whether Luthen is inciting rebellion for the sake of toppling the Empire, or whether he truly just wants to spread mass suffering because he knows he can use the dark side as a cloak to hide within, just as Palpatine had done decades earlier. Though we may be able to simply write off him calling himself a coward as a way of appealing to Saw's ego without revealing anything meaningful about himself, this could actually be the most damning revelation that Luthen makes throughout the first season. As Order 66 rang throughout the galaxy, the majority of early survivors were actually Padawans and apprentices, as most Jedi Knights and Masters sacrificed themselves to save those who would surely die without them. We've seen this over and over again with individuals like the Second and Fifth Sisters, Kanan Jarrus, and Cal Kestis surviving into the Purge due to their Master's sacrifices. However, many of the Jedi Knights and Masters who did survive did so by completely forsaking others. While Obi-Wan Kenobi fought his way into the Jedi Temple after Order 66 and sent a warning to prevent others from falling into a trap, we see him turning away other survivors on Tatooine entirely out of self-preservation. We see others like Taron Malicos who not only fled to save themselves but fully gave in to cowardice by hiding on Dathomir, manipulating the Night Sister Merrin, just a child at the time, into giving him dominion over the Night Brother clan, and fully embracing the dark side. Luthen would have been roughly equal to Obi-Wan Kenobi's age at the end of the Clone Wars, so if he had been a Jedi, he would have likely been a Knight or possibly even a Jedi Master. Many surviving Jedi suffered from some form of survivor's guilt, whether it was Cal Kestis blaming himself for Jero Tapal's death, or Obi-Wan who blamed himself for Anakin's fall to the dark side. For a Knight or Master to survive, it is entirely possible that Luthen had been forced to perform acts that most Jedi Guardians might consider cowardly, either by allowing others to sacrifice themselves on his behalf, or killing others to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Inquisitorius. It is interesting to observe the interactions between Luthen and his assistant Kleya. Kleya is the only person Luthen ever appears to relax and drop his guard around, and we get the impression that Kleya would do anything for Luthen, even if it means protecting him from himself. It is interesting to observe that their age differences are roughly equivalent to Master and Apprentice, and both of their current ages would seem to align with a Master in his early 30s and an Apprentice in pre to early teens at the end of the Clone Wars, not so dissimilar from the age difference between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn, for instance. However, Luthen and Kleya's relationship could just be a coincidence, but that does bring us to investigate how he conducts his legitimate business. During his first visit to Coruscant, he calls up a predetermined landing protocol for his ship's AI to execute, while he changes his appearance to fit his persona as a high-end antiques dealer. For those willing to do a deeper investigation, more clues can be found in Luthen's AI map showing planets he visits regularly enough to have pre-established landing protocols for. Hats off to Meta Nerd's lore for the huge amount of work he put in to track down and identify every point on this map, and if you haven't seen his video identifying and discussing the importance of these planets, I'll link it in the description below. Every planet on this map would be important to Luthen in one fashion or another. However, it is interesting that of the worlds that have strong ties to the Force, the vast majority of these are worlds that are attuned to the dark side or were the sites of horrific events that would have left lasting echoes in the Force. Luthen could just be there in search of artifacts to sell in his shop, but given a fairly well-balanced selection of light and dark side artifacts, the types of worlds he frequents does not seem to line up solely with gathering inventory for his legitimate front business. Worlds with a strong dark side presence were used by many survivors of Order 66 to conceal their presence, whether it's Taron Malicos hiding on Dathomir or Yoda escaping to Dagobah. So far, none of this information is giving us definitive proof of Luthen's history with the Force, so let's go ahead and move on to the most telling interaction we ever see from Luthen, and that is his meeting with Lonnie Jung.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm. Kindness, kinship. Love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, has set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there was no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything! Just stay with me, Lonnie. I need all the heroes I can get.
First, please forgive me as I just have to gush over what I personally consider to be the single greatest monologue in Stellan Skarsgård's career and possibly the greatest speech in all of Star Wars history. For the first time, we can see Luthen exhibit raw, unadulterated emotion as he becomes visibly and audibly angry, an emotion most certainly tied to the dark side. If we listen closely, there are many phrases and terms he uses that directly point to a shattered affiliation with the Jedi Order.
Calm. Kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space.
This is already a powerful response to Lonnie's question, but carries additional weight when you realize that this is actually a direct reference to the Jedi Code, which begins with the phrase, "There is no emotion, there is peace," and later goes on to say, "There is no chaos, there is harmony." Two defining tenets of being a Jedi, which Luthen states he has willingly sacrificed to accomplish his goals.
I share my dreams with ghosts.
This could be a reference to being in commune with Force ghosts like Qui-Gon Jinn, however, I don't personally believe that this is his true meaning. Rather, it's most likely that he is referring to the many friends, brothers, and sisters in the Force, masters and apprentices, that were lost during Order 66, leaving Luthen alone in the galaxy.
I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do.
This is a rather interesting schedule of events that Luthen has created. Andor takes place 5 years before the Battle of Yavin, and the Clone Wars ended in 19 BBY. This would mean that it is entirely possible that Luthen has been planning this rebellion since even before the rise of the Empire. It was not unheard of for high-ranking Jedi to desert, rebel, or even turn to the dark side, especially toward the height of the Clone Wars. Could Luthen have sensed that there was something wrong with the way that the Clone Wars were influencing the Republic's governance and corrupting the Jedi? Could something have happened during the Clone Wars to have prompted him to forge a contingency plan ahead of time? It's possible, but it's also just as possible that he's simply rounding up, and the timeline of the Clone Wars does get a bit fuzzy at times. So let's go ahead and keep exploring this monologue.
My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, has set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice?
He speaks of being a savior fighting injustice with a path laid before him. This language is exactly what one might expect to hear from a Jedi Guardian, one of 3 schools of thought among Jedi who believed that it was the duty of the Jedi to not only protect the weak, but to challenge injustice and corruption wherever it may be found. It is also more than mere coincidence that Jedi Guardians predominantly used blue Kyber in their lightsabers, another indicator that the Kyber given to Andor was from his own lightsaber.
I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude.
Though it's easy to assume he's referring to using Lonnie, an Imperial intelligence officer, to gather actionable intelligence against the Empire and coldly sacrificing the lives of good people to protect the cause, but the true meaning behind this statement is actually much deeper than that. Throughout the Clone Wars, we saw the actions of Sheev Palpatine, an amenable, practical, and respectable politician on the outside, but behind the scenes, a powerful Force user who manipulated everyone around him and orchestrated both sides of a galaxy-spanning civil war. The implications of a man who wears fine clothing and cavorts with the upper echelons of society by day but roams the galaxy sowing discontent and skulking in shadows by night is an all too frightening parallel that only a former high-ranking Jedi would be able to recognize.
So what do I sacrifice?
everything!
This discourse is absolutely chilling and conveys levels of meaning that calls into question not whether Luthen was ever a Jedi, but instead whether he still considers himself a Jedi, or is he slowly slipping closer and closer to the dark side. The simple fact of the matter is that we just don't know. Luthen is a perfect example of the masterful storytelling that can restore faith in Disney Star Wars. I am thrilled and completely impatient to see what we can find out about Luthen in Season 2, and all we can do is hope that they don't waste him as a character like Anyway, thank you for sticking around this long. We would love to hear your thoughts about Luthen's past and possible fate, as we have yet to see him mentioned anywhere outside of Andor Season 1. A like and sub would also be amazing, but I get it if you prefer to just watch and judge silently from the shadows like a dirty Sith. Anyway, I hope to see you all here next time, and may the Force be with you always.